I hadn't planned on coming back alone. After the funeral, my parents talked about hiring a company to handle the house. Clean it out, list it, forget about it. That was the sensible option. The house had been empty since my grandparents died within months of each other, and no one wanted to spend more time there than necessary. I volunteered before anyone could stop me. I told them it would be easier if someone familiar went through it first, that I could separate what was worth keeping from what wasn't, that it would save money. None of that was the real reason. The house sat at the end of a quiet residential street, the kind built in the late 60s and never truly updated. One story, low roofline, dull siding faded by decades of weather. I'd seen it 1,000 times as a kid, but standing in front of it again as an adult, it felt smaller than it had in my memory, shorter, tighter, like it had contracted while no one was looking. The key stuck in the lock. That alone was enough to make my chest tighten. When the door finally opened, the smell hit me immediately. Old air, dust, something faintly sour beneath it all, like damp cardboard. But layered through, that was another scent I hadn't expected. Cleaner. The lemony chemical my grandmother used on every surface, every Saturday, without fail. It shouldn't have been there anymore. I stood in the doorway longer than necessary, breathing it in, feeling something stir that I couldn't quite name. Not nostalgia, not comfort. Something closer to unease. The house was quiet in a way that felt deliberate. No ticking clocks, no distant hum of appliances. Even the air felt still, heavy in my lungs. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, the sound echoing more than it should have in the empty space. My footsteps carried as I moved through the living room. The furniture was gone. My parents had already taken care of the larger items, but the outlines remained. Lighter patches on the carpet where couches and tables had once sat. Faint rectangles on the walls where pictures had hung for decades. I knew this house. I could have walked it blindfolded once. And yet, something about being here now felt wrong. I moved slowly, letting my eyes trace the familiar layout. Kitchen to the right, hallway straight ahead, bedrooms branching off like ribs. Everything was where it was supposed to be. Everything except the feeling in my stomach. It started the moment I reached the end of the hallway. I stopped without realizing why. The hallway terminated in a blank wall, just as it always had. No door, no closet, just paint, slightly uneven from an old repair job. I stared at it, my heart beating a little faster, a faint pressure building behind my eyes. This was where it always started. I was 7 the first time I'd told anyone about the room. At least that was the first time I remembered being brave enough to say it out loud. I hadn't had the words for it back then. Just the certainty that there was a place in the house that wasn't supposed to be there. A space that didn't belong to the rest of it. I'd told my parents there was a room I couldn't find during the day, but that I remembered clearly at night. They'd exchanged looks over my head, smiled too quickly. My grandmother had knelt down in front of me, her hands warm and firm on my shoulders. "Bad dreams," she'd said. That's all. I'd insisted it wasn't a dream. I could remember the smell, the way the air felt colder there, the sound, something like breathing, but not quite. I'd tried to explain that it wasn't scary because it was dark, but because it felt wrong. That had been when my grandfather had spoken up. "Kyle," he'd said gently, "kids imagine things. That's normal." The conversation had ended there. After that, every mention of the room was dismissed before I could finish a sentence. Fantasies, nightmares, stories I'd picked up from television. Eventually, I learned to stop bringing it up, but the memory never went away. Standing in the hallway now, I felt it press against me again. Not vivid images, not a clear picture, just a certainty, uncomfortable and persistent, that something was missing. I shook my head and forced myself to keep moving. I wasn't here to indulge childhood fears. The bedroom that had once been mine was unchanged structurally, though stripped of anything personal. The closet door still stuck when opened too quickly. The window still faced the side yard where I'd once tried to dig a hole to china. I moved from room to room, opening cabinets, checking corners, looking for anything out of place. Everything made sense. Measurements matched what they should. There were no hidden doors, no false panels, no obvious tricks. By the time I reached the kitchen, the rational part of my brain had started to assert itself. This is why no one believed you, I thought. There's nothing here. The basement door was tucked beside the pantry, a narrow wooden thing painted the same off-white as the walls. I rested my hand on the knob and hesitated. The smell changed when I opened it. Cooler, earthier, concrete, and old metal. The basement light flickered before settling into a dull glow. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, each step echoing softly. I'd hated the basement as a kid, not because anything had happened there, but because it always felt too quiet, like sound didn't behave properly. At the bottom, I paused. The basement was unfinished, just as I remembered. Concrete walls, exposed beams, a scattering of old shelves and storage bins left behind after my parents had cleared out the rest. The furnace loomed in one corner, silent and cold. Nothing moved. Still, the sense of unease sharpened. I walked the perimeter slowly, counting steps without meaning to. The space was rectangular, straightforward, no obvious irregularities. But as I reached the far wall, something nagged at me. The dimensions felt off. I couldn't have said why. Not yet. But the feeling was there. The same one I'd had as a child when I'd been sure the house was lying to me. I stepped back and looked again, scanning the wall from floor to ceiling. Smooth concrete, a few hairline cracks, nothing remarkable. "You're doing it again," I muttered. I climbed the stairs and returned to the living room, then to the hallway, retracing my steps with deliberate care. I tried to think like an adult, not a scared kid grasping at impressions. If there had been a room, it would have taken up space. Space had to come from somewhere. That thought followed me as I moved through the house again, this time with intention. I started measuring, counting paces, comparing distances between exterior walls and interior ones. The numbers didn't line up neatly in my head yet, but the more I checked, the more certain I became of one thing. There was less house on the inside than there should have been. The realization sent a chill through me. I sat down on the bare living room floor, my back against the wall, and stared at the hallway where my childhood bedroom waited in silence. My family had been so sure, so quick to dismiss me. I'd accepted their certainty because it was easier than trusting my own fear. But fear didn't usually persist this long. Fear didn't wait decades and then resurface the moment you stepped back inside a place. I wasn't here to mourn. I wasn't here to relive old memories. I stood up slowly, feeling a strange calm settle over me. If there was a room, I would find it. Not by guessing, not by remembering, but by proving it had to exist. Whatever I'd seen as a child, whatever had scared me enough to follow me into adulthood, I was done pretending it had never been real. This time I would find evidence, and I wouldn't stop until I did. I approached it like a problem that could be solved. That was the only way I could justify staying. If I treated the house like an emotional trap, I'd either panic or start seeing things that weren't there. If I treated it like a structure, wood, concrete, measurements, it would either confirm my memory or finally put it to rest. I told myself that was all I wanted, proof that I'd been wrong. The first thing I did was find the paperwork. My grandparents had kept everything. Deeds, tax records, appliance manuals from the 70s, folded and yellowed. In the hall closet, behind a stack of old coats, I found a cardboard box labeled House in my grandfather's careful block letters. Inside were blueprints, not originals, copies made years after construction, but detailed enough to show dimensions, wall thickness, crawl spaces. I spread them out on the dining room table and studied them until the lines started to blur. On paper, the house was simple. Rectangular footprint, one story, full basement, no additions, no substructures, no rooms without doors. I walked the house again with the plans in my hand. Living room, matched. Kitchen, matched. Bedrooms, matched. Bathrooms, matched. Every wall lined up. Every doorway existed where it was supposed to. I measured distances with my own steps, then checked them against the drawings. The numbers were close enough to dismiss any minor difference as age, settling, or my own inconsistency. By the time I reached the basement again, a knot had formed in my chest. This is stupid, I thought. This is what they meant. You're chasing a childhood fear because it feels unfinished. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, the blueprints folded under my arm, and took a slow breath. The basement looked exactly the same as before. Concrete walls, support beams, the furnace, a workbench along one side, dusty but intact, metal shelving units stacked with old paint cans and jars of unidentifiable hardware. Normal. I walked the perimeter again, this time with the tape measure I'd brought down from the garage. I measured the length of each wall, writing the numbers down in a notebook, then checked them against the plans. They matched. I exhaled, longer this time. There it is, I thought. That's the answer. There's nothing here. I sat on one of the storage bins and flipped through my notes, forcing myself to confront the obvious conclusion. Every part of the house accounted for, every space visible and measurable. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was being glossed over. It wasn't the walls that bothered me. It was the silence. Basements make noise. Pipes click. The house settles. Air moves through vents. Even empty, a place like this should have had some kind of background sound. Here, there was nothing. No drip, no hum, no distant echo of the outside world. It felt sealed. I stood again and walked to the center of the basement, closing my eyes. That was when the memory sharpened. Not visually, sensory. The darkness wasn't just the absence of light. It was thick, like it pressed in on you. The air had smelled different there. Stale, but not like dust. Something heavier, metallic maybe, or organic. And there had been sounds, not voices, not words, just movement. Slow, inconsistent, like someone shifting their weight in a space too small to do it comfortably. My eyes snapped open. The basement was unchanged, bright enough under the single overhead bulb. Empty. I laughed once, sharp and humorless. "Get it together," I said out loud. I went back upstairs and spent the next 2 hours doing the same thing again. Measuring, comparing, sketching my own version of the floor plan, annotating it with distances, angles, wall thicknesses. Every time the result was the same. On paper, the house made sense. In practice, it didn't. Late in the afternoon, I took my sketches outside and walked the perimeter of the house, measuring the exterior walls. I counted steps along the foundation, then compared those numbers to the interior measurements. That was when I noticed it. The discrepancy was small, less than a full stride, something most people would never catch. But once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. There was more house on the outside than there was on the inside. I checked again. Same result. I went back in, heart beating faster now, and recalculated everything. I double-checked my math, convinced I'd made a mistake. I measured the same walls 3 times. The numbers didn't change. The missing space wasn't obvious. It didn't announce itself. But it existed, a narrow margin of square footage that wasn't represented anywhere on the interior plans. I sat on the basement stairs and stared at the far wall. There were no doors there, no closets, no access points, just concrete. I tried to remember the room more clearly. It didn't help. The harder I focused, the more the details slipped away, leaving behind only impressions. Darkness, cold, that wrong, heavy smell, the sense of being somewhere you weren't supposed to be without knowing why. Maybe this was what memory did when it aged. Maybe the room had never been real, just a child's brain filling in gaps with fear. I wanted that explanation. I needed it. But as I folded the blueprints and put them back in the box, a quiet certainty settled over me, unwelcome and persistent. I hadn't proven myself wrong. I'd only proven that the house was hiding something. There was a space here that didn't belong to the rest of it, a room that existed without permission, and I was standing directly above it. I slept poorly that night, not because of noise or cold, but because my mind wouldn't stop returning to the same conclusion. I kept replaying the measurements, the margins, the small but undeniable difference between what the house showed me and what it should have contained. By morning, I was done pretending I could ignore it. I went straight back to the basement. This time, I brought everything with me: tape measure, notebook, pencil, the blueprints, my own sketches from the day before. I laid them out on the workbench beneath the single hanging bulb and forced myself to slow down. If there was a mistake, I would find it. I started by measuring the basement again, wall by wall, inch by inch. I pressed the tape flush against the concrete, accounting for beams, corners, and slight warps in the structure. I wrote everything down carefully, rounding nothing, double-checking each measurement before moving on. When I finished, I compared the numbers to the footprint of the house above. They didn't line up, not catastrophically, not in a way that screamed sabotage or hidden chambers, but enough. There was a strip of space, narrow, elongated, that didn't exist anywhere on the interior plans, too wide to be chalked up to structural variation, too consistent to be a coincidence. I ran the measurements a second time. Same result. I leaned against the cold concrete wall and closed my eyes, forcing my breathing to steady. Houses settle. Builders cut corners. Plans aren't always exact. I repeated those thoughts like a mantra. Then I opened my eyes and looked at the far wall. It was smooth mostly. A few old cracks, some discoloration near the floor. Nothing about it stood out at first glance. But now that I knew there was space missing, the wall felt different, less like a boundary and more like a suggestion. I walked along it slowly, dragging my fingers across the surface. The temperature changed subtly about halfway down. Not enough to feel cold exactly, just cooler. Like the air on the other side of the wall behaved differently. I stopped and pressed my palm flat against the concrete. The sensation was faint, but it was there, a difference. I stepped back and looked again, this time not at the wall itself, but at what stood in front of it. Shelving. Old metal units pushed flush against the concrete, stacked with boxes, paint cans, and rusted tools. They weren't organized. They weren't meant to be. They looked like they'd been placed there to be forgotten. I hadn't paid them much attention before. Now I moved closer. The shelves were old. The metal was dull, pitted with rust in places where moisture had eaten through the coating. The boxes on them were coated in a thick layer of dust, undisturbed for years. I brushed my fingers across one of the boxes. The dust didn't shift. That was strange. Even in an unused basement, dust patterns change. Air moves. Vibrations travel through the structure. Something should have disturbed it over the years. These shelves looked sealed in time. I crouched down and peered behind them as best I could. The space between the shelving unit and the wall was narrow, but not flush. There was a gap, small, irregular. I fetched a flashlight from the workbench and angled the beam behind the shelves. The concrete back there looked wrong. The texture changed slightly. The finish wasn't consistent with the rest of the basement wall. Where the surrounding concrete was rough and uneven, this section looked smoother, almost like it had been worked on more recently, or repaired. My pulse quickened. I stepped back and surveyed the shelving unit as a whole. It was heavier than the others, constructed from thicker steel. And unlike the rest, which wobbled slightly when pushed, this one didn't budge when I leaned my weight against it. I placed both hands on the frame and pushed harder. Nothing. The feet weren't bolted to the floor, but they might as well have been. Whatever sat behind this shelf had required it to stay exactly where it was. I remembered something then. As a kid, I'd been told not to touch the shelves in the basement. Not in a strict way, just casually dismissed. Old junk. Might fall over. But I'd listened. I'd never moved them. I wrapped my fingers around the edge of the metal frame and pulled. The shelf groaned, a low metallic protest echoing through the basement. Dust fell in a thick sheet, making me cough as I staggered back. The sound seemed louder than it should have been, like the basement wasn't used to noise. I pulled again, harder this time. The shelf shifted a few inches, scraping loudly against the concrete floor. Something behind it caught the light of my flashlight, reflecting it back in a thin, uneven line. I froze. The air moved. Not a breeze exactly, more like pressure equalizing. A subtle pull against my face, carrying with it a smell that made my stomach tighten. Stale. Not dust, not mold. Something older. I dragged the shelving unit fully aside and stepped closer to the wall. There it was. A vertical seam in the concrete, barely visible unless you were looking for it. The line wasn't straight. It wavered slightly, like it had been patched by hand. I ran my fingers along it and felt the difference immediately. This wasn't part of the original foundation. I pressed my ear against the wall. For a long moment there was nothing. Then, something faint. A soft, hollow quality. Not a sound, but the absence of solidity, like tapping on drywall instead of concrete. I straightened and aimed the flashlight at the seam again. Near the floor, just above the base, there was a hairline crack. I crouched down and held my hand near it. Air flowed through. Slow, steady, deliberate. My throat went dry. This wasn't imagination. This wasn't memory playing tricks on me. This was physical, measurable, real. I took a step back and looked at the wall as a whole now. The measurements made sense. The missing space had to be here, behind this wall. I stood there for several minutes, weighing my options. Every instinct I had told me to stop, to step away, to push the shelving unit back into place and pretend I'd never noticed any of this. That instinct had probably kept me safe as a child. But I wasn't a child anymore. I fetched a pry bar from the tool rack, my hands unsteady as I tested its weight. The metal felt cold and solid, reassuring in a way. I returned to the wall and wedged the flat end into the crack, applying gentle pressure at first. Nothing happened. I adjusted my grip and pushed harder. The wall gave a low, muted creak. Not the sharp crack of breaking concrete, but the reluctant sound of something shifting that hadn't been meant to move often. Dust trickled down from the seam. The smell intensified. I stepped back, heart pounding, staring at the wall as if it might respond on its own. It didn't. But the gap was wider now, wide enough to get my fingers into. I knew then that there was no going back. Whatever waited behind that wall, whatever my family had dismissed, ignored, or hidden, was closer than it had ever been. I looked once more at the basement stairs, at the light spilling down from above. Then I turned back to the wall, grabbed the shelving unit again, and dragged it completely out of the way. The space behind it was no longer hidden, and I made the decision I'd been circling since the moment I stepped into the house. I was going to open it. The wall didn't collapse. That was the first thing that struck me. I'd expected noise, cracking concrete, chunks breaking loose, something violent enough to justify the fear tightening in my chest. Instead, when I applied pressure with the pry bar again, the section of wall shifted inward with a dull, padded sound, like wood wrapped in plaster. Not a foundation wall, a cover. I stepped back instinctively as the panel tilted forward just enough to reveal darkness behind it. The air that slipped out was cold and stale, carrying a smell that hit me hard enough to make my eyes water. It was the smell I remembered. Not clearly, not as a nameable thing, but as an impression. Old moisture. Metal. Something bodily that had long since dried and sunk into surfaces. I raised the flashlight and aimed it into the opening. The beam cut through a narrow passage, barely wide enough for a person to move through sideways. The walls were unfinished, rough concrete on one side, exposed framing on the other. The ceiling was low. I would have to duck. I stood there for a long time, light shaking slightly in my hand, staring into that space. Every part of me wanted to shut it again. Every part of me knew I wouldn't. I pushed the panel farther open and stepped inside. The sound of the basement vanished immediately. The air changed the moment I crossed the threshold. It felt thicker, harder to draw into my lungs, like the space resisted being breathed in. The smell intensified, clinging to the back of my throat. The passage sloped downward slightly, just enough that my footing felt uncertain. I moved slowly, one hand braced against the wall, the other holding the flashlight out in front of me. The beam caught on scuffed concrete, uneven patches where something had brushed repeatedly against the surface. Halfway through the passage, I stopped. My heart was racing now, loud enough that I was sure it could be heard somewhere else, though I knew there was nowhere for it to go. I listened, holding my breath. Nothing, no movement, no sound. Just the quiet hum of my own blood in my ears. The passage ended abruptly. The flashlight beam spilled into a room. I didn't step inside right away. I didn't need to. I knew it. The shape was exactly as it had been in my memory. Small, rectangular, too enclosed to be anything but intentional. The ceiling was low enough that it pressed down on the space visually, making the room feel tighter than it actually was. There were no windows. The walls were bare concrete, but darker than the basement outside, stained unevenly by time and moisture. The floor sloped gently toward the center, where a circular drain sat, rusted and clogged with something dark and brittle. The smell was strongest here. I took one step in. The sound my foot made echoed wrong, too flat, too contained, the kind of sound you get when a room has been designed to keep noise from escaping. I swept the flashlight slowly across the space. A metal vent was set high into one wall, bolted in place, the grate thick and industrial. It wasn't connected to the rest of the house's ventilation system. I could tell that much from the construction. This had been added separately, purpose-built. Against one wall stood an old toilet, yellowed with age, the tank cracked but still bolted firmly into the concrete. There was no sink, no mirror, nothing to make the space livable, only usable. My stomach tightened. The furniture came next. It wasn't elaborate. No chains, no dramatic devices, just heavy, solid pieces made of wood and metal. A low frame anchored directly into the floor. Thick eye bolts set into the concrete at measured intervals. The wood was worn smooth in places where hands or wrists might have rubbed against it repeatedly. I recognized it instantly, even though I'd never understood it as a child. This was the room, not a dream, not a warped memory. The exact place I'd been afraid of without knowing why. My flashlight trembled as I moved it along the walls. That was when I saw the scratches. They weren't everywhere, just in certain sections, clustered at about chest height for an adult. Long, uneven lines carved into the concrete, some deep, some faint, overlapping in places, like whoever made them had returned to the same spots again and again. I stepped closer, my breath shallow. The scratches weren't random. They formed patterns, words. I couldn't read them yet, not fully, but I could see the shapes. Letters etched with desperation, uneven and hurried. Some were crossed out, some repeated. I swallowed hard. The room wasn't just familiar. It was remembered. My knees felt weak, and I leaned against the wall to steady myself. The concrete was cold through my shirt, grounding me just enough to keep from backing out immediately. As a child, I hadn't understood what I was seeing. I'd only known that the space felt wrong, that it wasn't meant for me or anyone, that something about it made my skin crawl in a way I couldn't explain. Now, standing in it as an adult, the truth pressed down on me with crushing weight. This room hadn't been imagined. It hadn't been misremembered. It had been used. And whatever had happened here had happened quietly, deliberately, and close enough to family dinners and bedtime routines that no one outside these walls had ever needed to know. I lowered the flashlight and let the beam rest on the floor drain, on the furniture, on the marks gouged into the walls. The fear I felt as a child had finally found its shape. And it was worse than anything I'd been afraid to imagine. I stayed longer than I should have. At first, I told myself I was just documenting things, making sense of what I was seeing before shock took over. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was simpler and harder to admit. I needed to know. I moved through the room slowly, forcing myself to look at everything I'd avoided at first glance. Up close, the space felt smaller, more oppressive. The air was stale in a way that suggested it had been sealed for long stretches of time, opened only when necessary. The furniture told its own story. The wooden frame anchored to the floor was worn smooth along the edges, not from age alone, but from repeated contact. Hands gripping, bodies shifting. The metal eye bolts were rusted, but the wear around them was clean, circular, consistent. This wasn't improvised. It had been planned. Near the drain, the concrete was darker, not wet, just stained, old marks that cleaning hadn't erased completely. I crouched down and ran my fingers just above the surface without touching it, my stomach tightening as I imagined how often that drain must have been used. The toilet was worse. It wasn't the fixture itself, but the way it had been positioned. Close enough to be reached without standing. Far enough from the walls to keep someone in the center of the room. The porcelain was chipped along the rim, the tank lid cracked and repaired once with a crude line of adhesive. Someone had expected this room to be occupied for long periods. I straightened and turned my attention back to the walls. The scratches I'd noticed earlier were clearer now that my eyes had adjusted. They weren't frantic in the way I'd expected. Some were, yes, deep, uneven gouges where fingers had dug in hard enough to break skin. But others were deliberate, careful. Letters carved slowly, patiently, as if whoever had made them knew they might have a long time to finish. I traced one with the beam of my flashlight. A name. I didn't recognize it at first. The letters were uneven, some overlapping where the concrete had resisted. Beneath it was a series of lines, short marks grouped together, then interrupted, then continued. Days, or weeks. Further along the wall, another name appeared. Fainter, smaller, followed by a date scratched so lightly it was almost invisible. I felt a wave of dizziness and had to brace myself against the wall again. These weren't random markings. They weren't the work of someone losing their mind. They were records. I moved from wall to wall, reading what I could, piecing fragments together. Some messages were incomplete, words cut off mid-letter, sentences trailing into nothing. Please, don't let them. I hear them upstairs. That one made my throat close. Upstairs. I thought of my grandparents' living room, the kitchen table, family dinners, laughter. The television turned up just loud enough to fill the house in the evenings. I forced myself to keep going. Near the far corner of the room, lower on the wall, I found the name that made everything stop. It was written more clearly than the others, the letters pressed deep into the concrete, as if the person carving them had known exactly how important it was that they be legible. I recognized it immediately. It was the neighbor, the man who had lived 2 houses down when I was a child. Quiet, middle-aged. He'd waved sometimes when he saw us outside, always polite, never lingering. I remembered my grandparents mentioning him once or twice, how he kept to himself, how no one had seen him in a while. I remembered the day people started asking questions. Police cars on the street, adults talking in low voices, someone saying he'd just vanished, no signs of a struggle, no body, no explanation. Eventually, the conversation stopped. Life went on. I stared at his name carved into the wall until my vision blurred. Below it were marks, many more than the others. Long rows of tallies, some scratched out violently, others continued neatly, right up until the concrete surface was too damaged to hold more. I did the math without meaning to. The number made my knees go weak. He hadn't been held here for a night, or a weekend. He'd been here for a long time. I sank down onto the floor, my back against the wall, my breath coming shallow and fast. My mind scrambled for alternatives, for explanations that didn't lead where this one did. Someone else could have done this, I thought. Someone outside the family. Someone who used the house without their knowledge. But the room was hidden behind a wall only someone familiar with the structure would have known to build. The furniture was anchored with care. The ventilation had been added deliberately, not hastily, and the house had never felt unfamiliar to me as a child, only wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. I thought of the times my grandparents had insisted I stay out of the basement, how easily they'd redirected me when I wandered too close to certain areas, how quickly they'd dismissed my fear. They hadn't panicked, they hadn't been surprised, they'd been confident. I didn't know which of them had been responsible. I didn't know if it had been both, or if someone else in the family had played a role. What I knew was worse. Someone I had loved had known about this room, had used it, and had gone upstairs afterward to eat dinner, watch television, and tuck me into bed. I sat there until my breathing slowed, until the shock dulled into something heavier and more permanent. Denial was no longer an option. The room wasn't a misunderstanding. The memories weren't fantasies, and the man who had disappeared hadn't simply walked away from his life. The truth was here, carved into concrete, sealed behind a wall, and kept quiet for decades. I rose slowly, my legs unsteady. I didn't need more proof. I had enough. And as much as part of me wanted to turn away from it, to close the wall and pretend I'd never seen any of this, another part, the part that had brought me back to this house in the first place, accepted what I'd found with a quiet, devastating certainty. This was real. All of it, and it had always been. I didn't leave right away. I stood in the room for a long time after the weight of the truth had settled, long enough for the shock to dull into something heavier and harder to move with. The air felt thicker now, as if the space itself resisted being acknowledged for too long. Eventually, I turned off the flashlight. The darkness returned instantly, complete and absolute. It felt familiar in a way that made my chest tighten. This was how the room wanted to exist, unseen, unlit, undisturbed. I backed out slowly, careful not to touch the walls again. The narrow passage felt tighter on the way out, my shoulders brushing concrete where they hadn't before. I didn't look back. In the basement, the normal sounds of the house returned, the faint creak of old beams, the distant noise of the street outside. They felt intrusive now, like a lie layered over something truer beneath it. I closed the panel. It slid back into place with the same dull, padded sound as before. No resistance, no finality, just concealment. I stood there for a moment, staring at the wall. Without the opening, it looked unremarkable again. Just concrete, just another boundary. I pushed the shelving unit back into place. The metal scraped softly against the floor as I eased it forward, aligning it exactly where it had been. When I finished, I brushed the dust back over the base with my shoe, undoing the marks I'd made. The shelves looked as they always had, forgotten, ignored, harmless. No one would notice anything different. I didn't call the police. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't take photos or collect samples or write down what I'd seen in a way that could survive scrutiny. I knew what questions would come, and I knew I wouldn't have answers that mattered. Who would believe it anyway? A hidden room in a family basement. A neighbor gone missing decades ago. Elderly grandparents who were already dead and could never speak for themselves. There would be investigations, excavations, headlines. And then there would be my name, tied forever to what had happened here. I wasn't protecting them. I was protecting the truth from being reduced to something smaller than it was. Because what I'd found wasn't just evidence of a crime. It was proof that something profoundly wrong had lived quietly alongside ordinary life. That it had been planned, maintained, and hidden without disrupting the routines of the people upstairs. That kind of evil didn't want attention. It wanted silence. I walked through the house one last time before leaving. The rooms felt the same as they had when I arrived. Empty, still, waiting. The kitchen smelled faintly of cleaner. The hallway ended in its blank wall. My childhood bedroom held nothing but dust and light. Nothing about the house warned you. At the front door, I paused with my hand on the knob and listened. The house made no sound, no creaks, no settling, no protest at being left alone again. Outside, the afternoon light felt too bright, too open. I locked the door behind me and slid the key into my pocket, already knowing I would never use it again. As I walked down the driveway, a single thought stayed with me, steady and unwelcome. Not everything wants to be found. Some things survive because they're hidden well enough, long enough, that the world builds itself around them and moves on. Houses get sold. Streets stay quiet. People forget. The house behind me would stand for years, maybe decades, without anyone ever knowing what had been sealed inside it. It would wait. And the room beneath it would remain exactly as it was, dark, intact, and patient. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I carried the weight of what I'd found with me, quiet and permanent, as I drove away and left the house to continue doing what it had always done best. Standing there, keeping its secrets.